on Q&A, Wall Street Journal investigative reporter Keach Hagey discusses her book, The King of Content, Sumner Redstone's battle for Viacom, CBS, and everlasting control of his media empire.
Keach Hagey of the Wall Street Journal. Who is Sumner Redstone?
Sumner Redstone is one of the great media moguls of the 20th and 21st centuries. He amassed an enormous media empire that today spans CBS and Viacom, which, if you don't know about Viacom, that owns MTV, Paramount Pictures, Nickelodeon, and of course CBS owns the CBS broadcast channel, as well as a whole array of other things like Simon & Schuster.
I'm going to dip way into your book and start off with this and ask you to explain it. This is on page 226. All this, and Sumner wasn't paying a great deal of attention. By late 2010, his tawdry skirt chasing had become a corporate liability. Brandon, who had grown tired of introducing his grandfather to girls and the payouts that often followed, decided his grandfather needed a steadier, classier girlfriend, and he hired Patty, how do you pronounce it? Stanger, host of the Millionaire Matchmaker on Bravo, to set him up. He was looking for a quality girl he could have a serious relationship with. That's a quote from Ms. Stanger. What's that about?
So this is Sumner after he's, made his millions and billions, and he's in his 80s at this point. He's twice divorced. And after his second divorce, he was out in Hollywood. And, when you're out in Hollywood and very rich, you have a lot of opportunities to meet young women. And he got excited about that. And after he had a battle with prostate cancer and came through it, he really saw being seen with young women as a sign of his vitality, right? And being with them was a sign that he could tell the world, I am going to live forever, as he loved to say. So he would go to these Hollywood parties, and sometimes he would go home with his grandson's date, things like that. And it was very awkward for the executives in Viacom and CBS because he's still the controlling shareholder of these companies, and he would do really weird things. For example, the Electric Barbarellas. This was a band of young women that was on MTV because he had befriended one of them and sort of cajoled the MTV executives to put them on the air. And he dated one of them for a while. So business decisions that really went against what the MTV executives would have normally done were being forced down their throats because of his love for young ladies. So the people around him said, we got to put a stop to this. Let's go find Sumner a steady girlfriend. And they hired Patty Stanger to do that, and that is how Sydney Holland came into his life.
And who is Sydney Holland?
So Sydney Holland is one of two women who lived with Sumner for about 3 years, from about 2013 to 2016. And at this point, he was, really not well, especially the back half of that. They took care of him, and Sydney was his girlfriend, and the other one, Manuela Herzer, was sort of an ex-girlfriend who also was like a friend. And they controlled access to him, and this even between Sumner and the executives of Viacom and CBS. And eventually they were ousted, and it was sort of their ousting from his mansion and his life that set in motion this sort of amazing drama and corporate warfare that has kept Viacom and CBS in the front pages of the newspapers for the last 3 years.
How old is he?
He's 95.
Where does he live?
He lives in Beverly Hills.
What kind of health does he have at this point?
Not good. Stable, but not good. People who know him say that he can't speak. He can't eat. He has a feeding tube. He can sometimes grunt, but he mostly communicated, as of about a year ago, through an iPad loaded with snippets of his voice, where he would push buttons. They would say yes, no, and one is his favorite curse words. So he is, barely there, I guess is how people...
Have you met him?
I have not. He was very ill before I ever started working on this project.
Any reaction about this book that you wrote from the family?
Well, I can't really answer that question directly because there has been no public reaction, let me put it that way. I mean, a lot of my discussions in this book and my reporting for this book is on background, and I need to protect the sources that I talk to for the book, but there has been no public outcry, certainly.
There's at page 275, it's at the end of a trial in May 6, 2016 in Los Angeles Superior Court. Were you in the courtroom?
I was not in the courtroom. I actually was on maternity leave.
So what was the trial and why was it so important? It's near the end of your book.
This is the final trial for the Battle of Viacom, right, in 2016. So this was the trial between two sides. There were multiple trials happening at the same time, but basically this was a giant power struggle happening between Viacom, the former CEO of Viacom, Philippe Dauman, and really Sumner's daughter, Sherry Redstone, who in the wake of this really took over the family holding company, which is called National Amusements, which controls CBS and Viacom, and we now see is running the entire empire, both CBS and Viacom. She's in charge, clearly. And in this trial, basically Philippe had been not just the head of Viacom, but he was also a trustee of the trust that was going to control all of the controlling stock of both CBS and Viacom that the family holding company had. And one day in May, one day out of the blue sky, he was kicked off the trust along with another lawyer who'd been on there for a long time. And he sued and said, it's not Sumner who's kicking me off the trust, it's his daughter, and this is an invalid thing. These lawyers, I've never heard of them. This is just a charade. And that started a series of lawsuits in multiple states that led to the overhaul of the Viacom board, his ouster, and the rise to power of Sherry Redstone.
I'm going to read, I can't read it all, as you well know, the last paragraph in this particular chapter. Around lunchtime, the trial was dismissed. An audio recording of Sumner pleading with a prospective lover to participate in a four-way with Bob and the most beautiful producer was posted to the gossip site Radar Online. First of all, how did it get to Radar Online?
Well, we don't know. So first of all, I have to correct what I said. You were asking me about a trial. I was giving you an answer about a subsequent trial that happened a month after that. The one you were asking about was the trial about Manuela Herzer. So that was a trial that happened in the spring of that year, and that was the fight to get Manuela out of the house. After she was kicked out of the mansion, as I mentioned, she turned around and sued and said, Sumner does not have mental capacity. And this is a really big deal in the corporate world because people have been wondering for a year, how's Sumner doing? Why haven't we heard from him? What's going on? The stock of Viacom is down. And Manuela seemed to provide investors an answer to this. Well, what's going on is he doesn't have mental capacity, she said. And she was suing to be reinstated as his health guardian, basically. But also to say that his decision to kick her out of the house was invalid, and oh, by the way, his decision to write her out of his will, which all happened at the same time, was invalid. So that trial, which culminated in this absolute zoo where Sumner was on a videotape being interviewed, but no one could actually see the tape. They gave a transcript, but there was someone sort of interpreting his grunts. But he did say that he didn't want Manuela in his life, and he wanted his daughter, Sherry, to be there. So Manuela's trial was dismissed, and that was sort of the end of Manuela. And that after that is when that bizarre audio tape was leaked. We don't really know who leaked it.
I can't read much more of it. It says Bob's never done a threesome with two men. Sumner says on the recording he's done it with two women, so he's a little bit nervous, but he's going to come because I want him to. So what will probably happen will probably really excite you. It goes on, and it just can't be read on television. Has that ever been published other than in your book?
Well, it was published on Radar Online, so people knew about it. And if there's an audio recording, that's like pretty clearly his voice. And look, people around him say that he had a very lively love life. In all of the court papers, both sides, they describe women coming in, being paid for companionship, and this was a pretty normal thing that was happening all the time.
Does he still control 80% of the company?
Yes. So it's a little arcane, but he controls 80% of National Amusements, which is this holding company, and that company controls 80% of the voting shares of both CBS and Viacom.
One of the reasons I go this way is because there were people on the board that are well known. Joseph Califano was on the board. Senator William Cohen of Maine was on the board. Dick Parsons lately came on the board as chairman for a while. Deborah Norville is on the board. With all of these shenanigans in his life, plus having a federal license through the CBS-owned stations, how has he been able to maintain control of this? And why didn't some of those board members, if they knew this, say, gone?
That is the $6 billion question. Especially because some of the members on the board who aren't the ones you listed, but he had several good friends on the board, CBS producers, who would go over to his house for movie night every Sunday. I mean, they knew the situation, and one of them, actually, who just passed away, went into his house and took a video of Sumner in January of last year, or this year, to try to prove to the world, you know, he's not okay. And it was great with legal wrangling about that videotape, and we'll see whether we ever see the light of day. But your question is, how did the board members not know? And that is my biggest question.
Or did they know?
So he was very ill, and toward the end of his, public life, when a lot of these board members were there, but some of them have been there for many, many years. I think it's impossible that the top people at the company and top people around him did not know that he was not really capable of making these decisions. Now, the official position of the family to this day is that he still has mental capacity. That is a legal position that they have.
Add to this that CBS had to fire Jeff Fager, who ran 60 Minutes. They fired Les Moonves, who ran the CBS network, for sexual harassment. And then you read this book, and I'm not even going to come close to getting to all the details in this book. How did people like this keep a federal license, I'll ask it again, to run television stations across the United States and have one of the most important networks in television history?
Well, this book sort of ends before the CBS fight, but there was a Viacom fight and then a CBS fight, and they're very similar. I mean, they're basically the same fight played out twice.
They're two separate corporations.
Two separate corporations, but the Redstones control both of them. But that fundamental question of where was the oversight? I mean, if many people said that if this book ends with a gigantic fight over Viacom, which had seen its stock price nearly drop by half, and everyone on Wall Street was wondering what is the CEO doing, and where is Sumner, who in the past would have fired a CEO for a mere wobble in the stock price? Why is he allowing this to happen? And the answer is because he wasn't really there. And so they're seeing that same thing with CBS now. It is, I think, a question that will not go away. It was raised during the litigation this year over Les Moonves. The question was raised, well, did Sherry Redstone come to power in an appropriate way? Is everyone telling the truth about Sumner's capacity? And I think we'll hear that question again before it's all over, even though people have tried to sort of push it aside, and there have been settlements in these lawsuits. It's still there.
When you dug into this book, what did you learn for the first time?
My favorite thing that I learned was that Sumner's father, Mickey Redstone, has been a bootlegger, and that really National Amusements was founded as a, I don't want to say a criminal enterprise, but there were criminals involved. It's not completely unusual for companies to have sort of underworld associations, but I did not understand just how deep the underworld associations that led to National Amusements were. Mickey Redstone's business partner was this guy, Doc Sagansky, who was a really famous bookie, and It's funny, the FBI finally gave me my FOIA request 15 months after I filed it about Doc Sagansky, and it just shows him receiving payments from the theaters that the Redstones owned up until the 50s. So he was a full partner, it's pretty clear, in the foundation of National Amusements.
Why did it take 15 months to get your FOIA request?
I don't know, I guess the wheels of government grind slowly.
So, the National Amusements and the ownership of the movie theaters, how important were they to Sumner Redstone eventually, accumulating all this wealth?
Very important. I mean, that was the foundation upon which this is all based. So Sumner loves to say that he is a self-made man and presents himself as building this empire. And he's absolutely a brilliant legal mind and deserves full credit for that. But much like Donald Trump, he took over his father's company. So his father, Mickey Redstone, built this chain of theaters, drive-in theaters that they then turned into indoor theaters and then these multiplexes. And they bought the land underneath the theaters so they could flip them like that. And that is what Sumner came into. And then he took that entity and used a lot of debt, used leverage, and used that to take over Viacom. So without the land purchases and the foundation that Mickey had created, Sumner would not have been able to become a media mogul.
Was there anything illegal about National Amusements when it owned just theaters, talking about the history in the past?
I mean, about the actual company? I don't think so. I mean, they had this very quiet partner who was in and out of prison various times and was had been a convicted criminal. And Mickey and Doc, they co-invested in some casinos with various members of the New England mob. So they had a lot of associations, but National Museums itself, no, there's no evidence that they were doing something illegal.
Another paragraph from your book on page 178. Sumner, meanwhile, had become a holy terror to people around him. He was known to throw a steak across the room, and when he found not cooked to his liking. And he was banned from Le Cirque, or is it Elios? Elios? In New York for his rudeness to the waitstaff. Once aboard a company plane, he threw a turkey leg at a flight attendant's head after learning that it had not come from the iconic Natanal delicatessen in Beverly Hills.
Natanals, yeah, that's
Natanals.
yeah.
How do you find this stuff out?
I mean, people around Sumner, I think a lot of them had something almost like PTSD, and they actually loved to share the stories of his abuse because he was a pretty abusive boss. He was also very smart, he was also very funny, but everyone seemed to have a Sumner story that they couldn't wait to tell. Because he was not like any other person. He had these sort of irrational fits of rage, and he yelled at his subordinates a great deal. So, when that happens to you, it's not hard to find people wanting to tell you those stories.
I know this could go on for a long time, but how many people has he fired?
Oh, God. He famously fired all these CEOs, right? So he fired Frank Biondi, the former CEO of Viacom. He fired Tom Freston, and another former CEO of Viacom. So he did a lot of he tried to fire Tom Cruise, even though Tom Cruise didn't really work for him, but he made this great statement that he was going to fire Tom Cruise from Paramount Pictures. So he loved to just push people out at the minute that he sensed disloyalty.
You suggested when Frank Biondi, who was the CEO, I guess, of Viacom, when he fired him, that he didn't like the fact that he wouldn't go to dinner with him, that he was a normal guy that drove in from the Bronx or wherever he lived and in his own car, and he wanted him to live a different kind of life.
So Sumner loved nothing more than to sit and have dinner with his top executives. And when he bought Paramount Pictures, which was this sort of long-standing goal of his, that was really the most wonderful gift, that then he could go out to dinner with all these people in Hollywood and be this Hollywood figure. He liked to have dinner very early, especially as he got older. But that was his social life, was to hang out with his executives. And a lot of people said that he didn't have real friends. Now, I don't think that's really a fair assessment. I've spoken to people who really were his friends, but he didn't have a lot of them. And a lot of his socializing was through his companies.
How much is he worth today?
About $6 billion was the last Forbes estimate.
When you talked about Sidney Holland and Manuela Herzog, Herzer, excuse me, hard to keep track, you got so many names in this book. How much money did they walk away with?
150 million between the two of them.
Why?
Well, he gave them gifts. And that is what a lot of litigation in subsequent years has been about. He gave each of them around $75 million. And, you know, there was one day where he gave each of them $45 million in a single day. And it was sometime around that moment that his family, which had been sort of estranged from him, realized that they can't let this continue. And so they sort of began to talk to each other, and they befriended some of the nurses around him and started getting information about what was going on inside the mansion. And that, in some ways, led to at least the ouster of one of them.
This may be a bit of a stretch, but he owns Simon & Schuster,
Yeah.
the book publisher.
Correct.
They published Bob Woodward's book, Fear. He owns CBS Television News and all the programs, and they have gone after the President of the United States. What gives them the right to do this when they have in their midst somebody that should be investigated himself? Who owns it?
Well, I mean, he's a private businessman. People around this world say, this is how they sort of deal with this question. He stepped off the board under great pressure. So well, that was in February of 2016, I think I'm doing that right. So that was in the midst of this trial over Manuela Herzer. It was only after Manuela Herzer said, he doesn't have capacity, I'm going to get a judge to go in there and examine him. Like 3 days after that, then he finally stepped down from the boards of those two companies and handed over the executive chairmanships to their respective CEOs. But, you know, that was only because a gun was to their head, basically. So people close to the company would say that he's not technically on the board anymore, he's just an emeritus board member, and that they've updated they made these subtle little changes to the bylaws of National Amusements so that he doesn't have the ultimate say. You really have to like stand on one leg and squint an eye to see this logic, I find, but this is what it is, that he's only one vote among 7 of the board members of National Amusements. So they're the boards of the companies, and there's the board of National Amusements, which is a private entity that no one can really see inside, and it's mostly just Redstone family members and lawyers and stuff. But he's just one vote among 7, so even if he didn't have his marbles, he would only be one vote. The problem with that is that he personally still owns 80% of the stock of that entity. So it just really strains credulity that he is not in control legally.
For years, one of the stories that was told so often about him, and you write about it in the book, is the story of the fire at the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston. Tell the story, when did it happen, and how much of what he told in his own memoir was true.
So it was in 1979. He was staying on the 3rd floor of this beautiful hotel, the Copley Plaza Hotel in Boston, and there was a fire that broke out in the hallway. A couch right in the hallway had caught fire, and the way he tells the story is that he woke up, he smelled smoke, he went to the door, as you should never do if you're in a hotel fire. He opened the door, flames burst in, scorching him, and he tried to get to the window. Window wouldn't open. Finally found a window to open and hung outside, counting to 10 over and over, waiting for the fire trucks to come pick him up.
What floor was that again?
3rd floor.
3rd floor.
As the flames were just burning the flesh off of his hand. And it's absolutely true that he was very, very badly burned in the fire. People thought he wouldn't live. He had to have hours of surgery, and it was incredibly painful, and he really did almost die. And so he opens his autobiography, 2001 autobiography, with this story, which everyone knew about, because this is sort of the parable that was supposed to show what a tenacious guy he was, you know, just what a superhuman, tough guy he was, and that's how he acted in negotiations. So sort of a perfect metaphor for who he was in business. And that part of it is really true, but he tells the story, it makes it seem like he's alone in the hotel room. Of course, he wasn't alone in the hotel room. He was with his longtime mistress, Delsa Weiner, who at that point he'd been together with at least a decade. And she actually got up first, she got out first, she went down the ladder first. She had a blackened thumb, but that was basically it. And the weird thing to me about this story is that it was in the Boston Globe the next day that both of them were in the hospital. There was news footage of them like both climbing down the ladder. It wasn't really a secret, or it seems like it wouldn't be a hard to discover secret.
So he climbed down the ladder, he didn't hang by his hands?
He hung by his hands, and I guess the ladder came to him eventually.
How long did he hang by his hands?
He claims it was, it's at least 10 minutes, 12 minutes, something like that. And it's his version of the story. It's a little hard because then how did Delsa get out first? There's a ledge. Some versions of the story have he sort of nobly allowed her to go on the ledge, and then this was sort of an act of chivalry or something. But the other weird thing that I found out is that he was in a room that was adjoining the guy he was there to celebrate that night, this Warner Brothers distribution executive named Richard Hill, who was also in a room with a woman, not his wife, that night, and they both died, actually, of smoke inhalation in the hallway. So it's just like a much grislier, darker story.
When did you find that out in your research?
Just as I was just rummaging around and trying to understand who was there, and I tried to call around all the people who had any contact with the story.
If I understand it right, that he was with this Delsa Weiner as his mistress for decades, at the same time he was married twice. Explain all that. How long was he married to the first woman?
So Phyllis, who is his longtime wife of 52 years, that is the mother of his two children, Sherry and Brent. And from my research, he was not a very constant husband. It seemed like he cheated on her a fair amount, and there was a lot of fighting, and they tried to divorce each other multiple times throughout the decades. But one of my favorite things I really discovered in this book was that Delsa was not just a mistress. I mean, really, she was a second family. He was with her for decades. He was like a father to her children. She had 4 children, and one of her children actually named her child's middle name Sumner.
Did Phyllis know about Delsa during this time?
Absolutely. I mean, there was fighting about it at the home. That was part of what made it such a tense place to grow up for Sherry and Brent. And I think that the relationship between Delsa and Sumner was so interesting because Delsa was a writer. She was a very serious short story writer, and she had published a novel on Simon & Schuster around 2000. And she really shaped him. She gave him culture. She stood up to him. No one else stood up to him, but she stood up to him. And I really believe that she is what gave him the confidence that he had the taste that he could make bets on the movie studios. And he started in the late 70s and early 80s to do this investing that was based on what movies he thought were good. So, if you're an executive at a movie chain, you've got advanced views of the movies. So he would do that, and over time, he got confident enough in that he would buy stock at a movie studio if he thought their movies were good. He made a killing that way, and that's the money that he used to take over Viacom. But I really believe that it was partly this relationship with her, this intellectual woman, that helped give him the confidence to do that.
Is she alive?
She's not.
Is Phyllis alive?
She is.
How much money did Phyllis get in all this?
So Phyllis had the opportunity, when they divorced, to have what some thought would be the largest divorce settlement in the history of America, some $3 billion. In the end, they came to a compromise that she wouldn't take away half of his assets, even though she had the right to do that under Massachusetts law, and he was very worried that she was going to do that. But that they would put all the assets in a trust, and she would get the income. She would get half the income from the trust during her lifetime, and then when they pass away, that trust would go to be controlled by these 7 trustees for the benefit of their grandchildren. So Phyllis is doing fine, but she did not manage to actually take away half his assets, which would have meant he lost control of CBS and Viacom.
Because you do a lot of reporting on background, as you say, who actually, can you tell us, talked to you directly, allowed you to quote them?
There's a fair amount of quotes from Tom Freston in the book, the CEO of Viacom, and the former CEO of Viacom, as well as the former CEO, Philippe Damon. and Sherry Redstone, although I make clear that that reporting was done for the newspaper and a couple years before I started doing the book. There's also various Redstones here and there. So Karen Redstone, who is Sumner's granddaughter, is quoted several times in the book, as well as some cousins.
In the end, who gets that $6 billion that he's worth?
The grandchildren.
Just the grandchildren. What about Sherry Redstone and her brother?
Well, yes. I mean, you say in the end. That's like
You're
the
talking
end.
about after they would pass at some point.
Well, actually, it is set up for the benefit of the grandchildren. So Sherry would, she would be one of the trustees that would control it, but the actual payout or whatever is set up to be generation skipping, to skip taxes.
Who decides who the trustees are?
Well, I would say Sherry has been very influential in that decision recently. It was originally sort of a negotiation between, it came out of a divorce discussion. So it was really people on Phyllis's side and people on Sumner's side. Originally, their two kids were both on there, but then there was a falling out between Sumner and his son Brent, who took $250 million and moved to Colorado and doesn't want to see or hear any of these people ever again. And a lot of it is just lawyers. So they each have their divorce lawyer on there. They each have like lawyers who they trust. But at this point, it's National Amusements that really can choose. So it's ultimately up to Sherry.
This is not a knock at this person I'm going to ask you about. It is a shock to me to find out that Deborah Norville is 60 years old. But she's on the board and she's on the compensation committee. And she's the anchor of Inside Edition. What is she doing there in that capacity, in your opinion?
I mean, Sumner made some pretty interesting choices about who was going to be on the boards of those companies. She is not on the boards anymore, I don't think. I could be wrong about that, but she was part of the group that was overturned.
Online, I just checked. You can't keep up with it all.
Yeah.
She went on in 2013, I believe.
Yes, so I think she's part of the group that was ousted in the sort of power struggle in the end. In fact, yeah, for sure she is. But there are many interesting choices on the boards of those companies, or there had been when Sumner was fully in charge. And part of what Sherry has tried to do is professionalize the boards a little bit, get people with more media experience. I mean, although Deborah Norville has a lot of media experience, so.
Second wife, Paula.
Yeah. So Paula is such an interesting character in this whole thing because she wasn't the first wife that he met at the temple dance, and she wasn't one of these Hollywood women that he ultimately ran in with. But she was in the middle, and she's a school teacher. She's a school teacher in New York who had never had kids, and was sort of set up on a blind date with, and it actually seems like a very sweet story. I mean, it seems very genuine that they fell in love and got married, and were married for, I don't know, a handful of years. And it was just, at least they made an effort to say it was an amicable divorce, and she's actually still very friendly with him. She still comes, and even when he was with the other two girlfriends, he would always pick her up dinner at a restaurant and bring it to her. So they never really cut ties.
You say they had a prenup, of course.
Oh, yeah.
How much did she walk away with?
I can't remember. I think it was like $1 million or $2 million, something like, maybe it was up to $5 million, but single-digit millions. Not the double-digit millions that the later women got.
A couple of quotes. You quote in there Sumner Redstone saying, "I enjoy recognition."
It's so true. I think that was his mother who ultimately did that to him, who made him feel like he always had to be number one. There was no number two. He had to be number one. And I also think it was Boston Latin School that did a number on him. I got to know Boston Latin School pretty well in researching this, and it's such a prestigious institution. It's the oldest public school in the country, and they have this wall in the auditorium of, there are many signers of the Constitution, all these great patriots that have their name in gold lettering at the top, and the implication clearly for the students who get in there is you need to get your name on this wall. And Sumner does have his name on the wall, but there's a lower wall for people who donate to the school. So he bought his way onto the wall, although of course he's a very illustrious career as well.
What's his education background?
So he went to Boston Latin, and then he went to Harvard and Harvard Law. So, smart guy.
Did he practice law?
He did. So he thought that he was going to save the world through public service. He left Harvard Law and got the clerkship, the federal clerkship is the thing you're going to need to do if you want that kind of career. And then he actually went to go work at the Justice Department for a little while, during a time actually when the Justice Department was breaking up the studio system through the Paramount decision of 1948 and 49. That's when they decided that you can't have a movie studio and also run movie theaters. And they broke up. Paramount was the sprawling company that was totally vertically integrated, and they forced them to sell off their theaters. And that decision ended up having a huge impact in his business dealings for the rest of his life.
What years would that have been that he worked at the Justice Department?
So he was there in, it was the late 40s, so 48, 49 were when those decisions were, and then all the way through, I think, to 1951, when he went into private practice for an antitrust law firm. Did that for a few years, and that was sort of the beginning of his disillusionment with the law. He realized that, you know what, this is not saving the world. It's just a business, and as he said, if I'm going to go into business, I want to go into business for myself. So by 1954, he joined the family business, where his brother and father had been working for a decade or so together already, and he became a theater executive.
You do cite that people were upset with him that he voted for George W. Bush.
Yeah.
And why would they be upset with him, and what was his prior political visibility?
So he actually had some political ambitions. He was, I think, a campaign co-chairman for Ed Muskie, and he was a Democrat. He was a normal sort of middle of the road Democrat, I would say. And one person who knew him said, if the thing about Sumner is if he wasn't Jewish, he'd be president. I think that was one of his business partners used to say that about him. He had some political ambitions, and then as he got older, he just got more conservative. Some people said it had a little bit to do with Israel policy. He's from a Jewish family, but I think he disappointed people closest to him, including Delsa, with that conservative turn.
How much was the Iraq War part of why he endorsed George W. Bush?
I think it was before that, actually, that he did it. So if my timing is right, it was before that was part of Bush's narrative. So, maybe all the facts weren't in about Bush at that point.
I don't have it in front of me, but I'm going to test you on whether or not you can pronounce the kind of tea that Tom Freston drank that you pointed out in here. I want to know what it's about.
Ayahuasca? Yeah, that's it's a psychedelic. It's a psychedelic hallucinogen from South America that later in his career he had tried. Tom Freston, he's the CEO of MTV. He built MTV from the beginning, really, and turned it into this global juggernaut. And he hung out with the bands, and he was sort of a hipster guy. He's a hipster guy. And that was just like a little detail that I put in there to show you what a hipster he was.
There's a little insider thing that most people aren't going to care about. I wanted to ask you if you know, though, because for years, John Lack was a guy that started MTV, and then a lot of people would say Bob Pittman started MTV. You just said Tom Freston made it. Where does Freston, Lack, and Pittman fit into all this?
Yes, they're all in the book. And Pittman, of course, is maybe, if someone said, who is the true father, John Lack is the first. Pittman is the one that really put it on the map. And then Pittman ultimately left, and Freston, who was sort of a deputy to Pittman, then took it and made it a global juggernaut, as I said, made it into this huge international cable powerhouse, and he was there for decades. So all of them can credibly say that they created and shaped MTV, but that's the house that Tom Freston built.
You need to tell us what the impact of MTV has been on the people of this country. So
MTV did several things. It sort of created cable, along with CNN and HBO. It was, in 1981, one of the very, very first cable channels. So it was an anchor in the very idea of they used to call it narrowcast cable, a channel that had a specific voice that you would tune into, not because a certain show was on, but because of what it stood for or just the overall brand of the channel. That idea was replicated 500 times into the giant cable bundle that we now see framed today. But when I started covering television, which was, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, that was still at the peak of its existence. So it did that from a business perspective, but from a cultural perspective, there's no way to sum up how important it was. I mean, it was the youth cultural voice of this country for at least the last quarter of the 20th century. And today it is still trying to be a youth cultural voice, but because the cable apparatus that it helped create is crumbling, it's having to get creative about doing that.
I was actually going to quote you suggesting that crumbling pay TV castle falls into the sea. Do you think it will happen?
Oh yes, I do. It's happening right now. This morning I saw in my email 975,000, nearly 1 million subscribers were lost by big pay TV companies in the last quarter. That's just an extraordinary number. So it's been going down by 2-3% per year. So I think we will live in a place where less than half of the population subscribes to cable pretty soon. Like, that's going to happen soon.
So what happens to Sumner Redstone's $6 billion?
Well, that's a good question. I think everyone in the banking and Wall Street communities assumes that CBS and Viacom will have to be sold one way or another, whether they are going to be merged, as Jerry Redstone has been trying to do for 3 years first, and then sold, or sold one-off. They're just not big enough to survive in this world where we see their rival, Disney, gobbled up most of Fox, and is going to try to take a run at Netflix on its own to build its own direct-to-consumer player, which is enormously expensive, both in content cost and in technology cost. I mean, this is not something that you can have a bunch of small companies competing to do.
One of the things I wrote down as I was reading your book was everyone switched sides. How often what side was Sherry Redstone, his daughter, on? His son, Brent, is that his son?
Yes.
And then what do you mean by switch sides in all this?
Well, one of the weirder moments, this is a book made of lawsuits. So there are just constantly lawsuits, all in trials happening all the time. But Sherry's point of view in the sort of main lawsuit in this book, which was the power struggle over Viacom, was "My father has capacity." She has this amazing line where right after this coup happened that kicked Philippe off the trust, she said, I respect my father's decisions and his right to make them, or something like that. And throughout the whole thing, she was on the side saying, my father has capacity, and Philippe was on the side of saying he doesn't have capacity. And then, after that fight happened, there was a fight between the Redstones and the women to try to get the money back, try to get that $150 million back. And if you follow the logic of those lawsuits, they basically say these women swindled poor Sumner into giving them $150 million. And in order for that to be possible, he has to have something pretty close to not having capacity. So, of course, Sherry denies that she is behind those lawsuits. Whether it's Sherry, whether it's Sumner, call them the Redstones. You see how there's a conflict there between those 2 points. Either he has capacity or he doesn't, but
let's paint a picture. He's in Los Angeles. Does he have a feeding tube in his stomach?
Yes.
And he's 95 years old. Actually, the money, he can't do anything more with his money. But as he sits there, is he a happy man, an unhappy man? Do you have any idea whether the whole relationship with all the different women continues? And the 2 women that are gone, do they have the $75 million each in hand?
There has been a settlement with one of them who has had to pay some back, I believe. The fighting with the other one continues. So we'll see. I mean, it's been 3 years. Let me tell you who's gotten rich here is the lawyers, for sure. So he's, he's not especially well. His family is around him, though, which is a better situation than was happening before.
How much does that have to do with the fact they want the money?
I mean, I think that's like uncharitable, right? Like, I think families should be together, regardless.
After what you told us, the kind of life he lived, the women in the life, the marriages, the divorces, the mistresses.
Totally.
The families should still be very loyal.
Well,
I
don't know about loyal, but there were many years where he didn't see his family that much, partly because there was tension between the women and the family. So now those particular women are gone, and the family is at least with him a little bit more. So that's a little better than it had been in the past. There are still some women that come in and out, but they basically are family-approved women, and so that's kind of...
I guess my question to you, and it is crass to ask this question, would they be there if there wasn't money at the end of the rainbow?
I really think they would. I've gotten to know this world, and I mean, Sherry Redstone does love her father. She writes him these poems, has written him these poems every year for his birthday. And in fact, the real issue is that she wants so desperately to be loved by him, and that he was unable to ever really show her love. So now that she can be with him, it's sort of scratching an itch that she has had a long time in her life.
What does it say about her that she came out on top of all this?
It says that she's a Redstone. She's
a lawyer.
She's a lawyer. She's a lawyer, and she's smart, and she played her hand very well.
Another quote from the book, and I think he said this to Tom Freston. I think we are alone in this life.
Oh yeah.
Why'd you use that?
He said that to Henry Schleif, another Viacom Nautic Discovery executive. I thought that was such a telling moment, because that is how that is really how he felt. I mean, I mentioned before, people who knew him said he didn't really have many friends, and he saw everything as transactional, and he treated his family like it was a transaction. Everything had to be negotiated through lawyers. They communicated through faxes sometimes. I try to find the original source of some of the conflict between father and daughter, because Sumner and Sherry had a fraught relationship. But ultimately, that's how he felt, that he had been divorced from his wife, or he, at that point, was estranged from his wife, and had this transactional relationship with his children sometimes. At that point, his son was in the process of moving to Colorado, so he'd already about had enough, and he was alone.
Now, I wrote down that you have worked at Politico, you've been in Abu Dhabi, you worked for CBSNews.com, you worked at the Village Voice, you worked at Queens Chronicle, and you went to Stanford. Of all those, which has had the biggest impact on you? Of all those experiences?
It would be the Village Voice. So at the Village Voice, I was an intern for this investigative journalist named Wayne Barrett, who wrote the first book on Trump many years ago, and who passed away last year on the eve of Trump's election, actually. And Wayne taught me everything I know.
How did you get from Evansville, Indiana, to Stanford, and then to New York City? What drove you to do that?
Well, I went to Stanford right out of high school. I wanted to go to California. You're a fellow Hoosier, so sometimes it's nice to see the world, as delightful and beautiful as Indiana is. And I wanted to go straight to New York after college. I studied literature and art, and it seemed like all the good literature and art was mostly made in New York City, so I wanted to go be part of that.
How old are your children?
They're 2 and 4.
When did you meet your husband, and how?
Well, actually, my fellow intern at the Village Voice, his name is Luke Comer, he introduced me to his college roommate, who is now my husband. So I owe Wayne everything.
How did you get your job at the Wall Street Journal?
I was working at Politico, covering media. I've been covering media for a long time. And I got an email from Roger Narasetti, who at that time was working for News Corp, and he said, "Oh, there's this media opening job. Want to check it out?" I took the train up to New York, and that was that.
How many years now?
It's almost 7.
Page 124 of your book, these 2 pages are hard to even comprehend. It starts up at the top. Mickey died suddenly at age 85. Later, death stalked the Redstones for the rest of the year. What of all that can you remember? Who was Mickey, and what was his relationship to Sumner?
So Mickey was Sumner's father, and this was, I assume, let's see, when did Mickey die? What year was this?
I don't see a number on the page or
That's okay.
date.
So there was...
Could have been near 87.
Right. Okay. So that was right around the time that he bought Viacom, and Mickey and Belle, his mom, died within months of each other, I think, and they got to see him, I think, begin to take over Viacom, but they didn't really see the final thing. And I was so struck by in Mickey's obit, it mentions him as this theater impresario guy, but it never mentions Viacom at all, even though his son had just taken over like one of the biggest media companies. So I think it's one of the great sadnesses in Sumner's life that his mother and father didn't really see the full scope of what he accomplished.
Quick question, is your daughter named Belle?
Yes.
Because you dedicate the book to Belle and your husband, I assume your other daughter. Did you name her Belle because of finding the name here?
I did not. Belle is actually my mother's name.
Just a coincidence.
Just a weird coincidence.
All right, go down the rest of the page, though, and I can help on this because you probably haven't looked at this page for a while. Ruth Ann dies, and that turns out to be a tragedy. Who was Ruth Ann?
Oh, Ruth Ann is one of the saddest stories here in the book. Ruth Ann is the daughter of Sumner's brother, Edward. Eddie, as they called him. So, National Amusements, which was this theater chain, was a family business. So it was Mickey, Eddie, and Sumner who were running it for a long time. And Mickey wanted to pass the business down to his grandkids. There were 4 of them. So there were Sherry and Brent on one side, which were Sumner's kids, and there were Ruth Ann and Michael, who were Eddie's kids. And what happened to basically every other one of them, except for Sherry, is something really tragic and awful. And the most tragic and awful is Ruth Ann. So basically, Ruth Ann joined the Children of God cult in the 70s. Like one day, she was on the Brandeis campus, and they came through town, and she went off with them, went to South America, was basically never heard from again. Her parents hired these deprogrammers, these cult deprogrammers. They lobbied their local officials to try to pass anti-cult legislation. I mean, her parents were absolutely distraught, but they never really got her back. And then she ended up dying of AIDS in Tokyo, and they got a call from the Tokyo consulate saying, well, what should we do with the child? And they were like, what child? And she had a 3-year-old son, Gabriel Adam Redstone, who of course was an heir to this enormous fortune that they didn't even know about. And they flew over and got him, his parents, Eddie and Leela, and brought him up. And then almost immediately after that, Leela died. So that was part of the death that was stalking.
Well, also on that page, Belle dies, Leela dies.
Yeah.
There's so much that we haven't gotten to, as you well know, in this, and a lot of the intricacies of how they bought the different entities. What year did he buy CBS, and how did he get it?
So that was 2000, 99, 2000. It was weird because it was very hard for him to take over. Viacom was a fight. That was 1987, that was a fight. But by the time he went after CBS, he had already gobbled up Paramount in 94. And in 2000, he just had a sort of a friendly meeting with the head of CBS, and they merged. And it wasn't really a fraught thing, and they became, at that moment, that was the largest media deal in U.S. history. It would soon be eclipsed, but at that point in history, it was the biggest one.
Do you have any idea how much he changed, whether it's Paramount or Showtime or Viacom or Nickelodeon or CBS or Simon & Schuster? Did he have any personal impact on any of those organizations?
Oh, well, I think he really believed in MTV. So when he was trying to take over Viacom in 1987, the sort of hippie kids at MTV befriended him, including Bob Pittman and Tom Freston, and took him sort of smuggled him inside the building and said, look, this is MTV. He fell in love with it. He fell in love with the energy and really believed in the promise. He could see that this thing, which is still in 1987, was somewhat nascent, was just going to be like a rocket ship. And as he was the head of the company after he ended up taking it over, he really believed in that business and really invested in it, and yet had like sort of a hands-off approach, let his people run without too much micromanaging. So people who worked for him, as strange as it might sound despite all the firings, said that he was actually a pleasure to work for from a business perspective.
So after, how long did you spend with it, writing this book?
About 2 years.
What's the impact of money
Oh man.
on this whole group of people that you write about?
I think it's corrosive and sad, honestly. I mean, Ruth Ann is the best example. She watched her father be pushed out of the family business, basically. She watched her father and grandfather and uncles fighting about money. And so she said, this is disgusting. I'm going to go give all my money to this cult and go to South America. And the ones who stayed in the fold, I mean, it's just been nothing but fighting about money for decades. In the family pattern, it repeats itself from the 70s to the 90s to now. Just so many lawyers, so many lawsuits, and so many fights about money. It's incredibly sad. You wonder if these same people just ran like a dry cleaners, would they be happier?
Your book's been out about a half a year. Has it sold what you wanted it to sell?
I've been pleasantly surprised, yeah.
And of all the people you wrote about, if you had to write another book on somebody, who would you pick?
Oh man, that's tough. I would say that I don't know about like a character, but I'm very interested in the duopoly, Facebook, Google duopoly, and its impact on media. I think it's one of the most important issues today.
How many stories a week do you write for the Wall Street Journal? On average?
It really depends. Lately I've been trying to do more enterprise stories, so to write fewer stories, but less often. I don't always accomplish that, so I probably end up writing like 3 stories a week or something.
The name of this book is The King of Content, Sumner Redstone's battle for Viacom, CBS, and everlasting control of his media empire. Our guest has been Wall Street Journal reporter Keach Hagey. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qanda.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.